Welcome to the Climate Gap Quick Cuts, a podcast for busy people building climate solutions. We spotlight founders, builders, operators, and investors doing the hard work behind real progress. I'm Ben, co-founder of Element 6. We connect climate tech companies with the people who make scale possible. Let's get into it. Everyone wants smarter buildings, but there's a weak link nobody really talks about. The operational networks carrying all that data. They're under-provisioned, overburdened, and barely monitored. The result, unsurprisingly, devices drop offline and analytics stall. And no one can explain comfort calls. In this episode of Quick Cuts, I'm joined by Andrew Rodgers, co-founder of ACE IoT Solutions. We'll cover why building networks are more fragile than most people realize, where the blind spots and risks show up, and what healthier models for OT networks could look like. Let's get into it. Well, welcome, Andrew. It's really great to have you on Quick Cuts. Could you give everybody an introduction to you and your background, please?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Andrew Rodgers. I'm co-founder of ACE IoT Solutions. I, for a long time have said I'm new to the buildings industry, but that's like 10 years now, so I'm going to have to drop that soon.
Right.
I had a fairly circuitous path getting here, though. So I had a pretty good stint in industrial automation, and then in general sort of software development and IT, which I brought a lot from those experiences, and it's helped, it's helped me potentially be a more critical eye towards how the status quo works in the buildings. I think industrial maybe gave me the frustration with the vertically integrated sort of closed box stuff that we see a lot in buildings. I already dealt with that in one career. I'm done with it. And then the software and the IT side, really, those industries, it's really hard for folks outside of those industries to understand how intense the leaning and belief in self-determination that exists in those industries. So
yeah,
it's that's something, bringing that to buildings, bringing the idea that when something doesn't work well, we can just change it. It's really unique, right? Like if you're a construction person, you can't just change the building that you're building because you don't like it. There's material costs, there's all that. But when you're in software, you really do have that sort of just complete self-determination. And when you're stuck in these vendor systems, vendor silos, you don't really have that either. And so I think that's something that a lot of folks in the controls and buildings industry struggle with, that they know what's wrong, but they don't necessarily have the tools to fix it. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about a problem that, I've seen for a while, and now we're starting to build some tools to fix it and help with these building networks.
Well, let's define the problem. You said OT networks in buildings are often under-provisioned and overburdened. What does that look like on the ground for people who aren't down into the weeds?
So it's a couple of things, right? So there's the classic problem of we wrote a spec, we're building a building, we wrote a spec for a control system, and the controls vendor provides the network that is bare minimum to make it work. And no one is involved in the oversight. No one understands what equipment is providing that network. The controls vendor often buys off-the-shelf, non-managed switches.
Yeah. The
links are, at the threshold of link. There's just all these things that don't get really managed well in those situations. So that's one class of problem. And then increasingly, as cybersecurity has become more and more of a concern, we see, being forced to have IT engagement, which is good, but often those IT departments don't understand the constraints on the networks themselves or how the application layer interacts with the network layer. Mm-hmm. In the IT world, we benefit from having really clear separation between these application parts of the system and the network parts of the system. And in OT with BACnet, because of its legacy history, it gets muddy at best, and most IT departments don't understand that. So from both camps, both the IT fully engaged managing the network, and from the no one's engaged, no one's managing the network, we have similar kinds of problems. And I think what I've learned over the last 5 years or so of really focusing on this is it comes down to no one knowing when things are going wrong and no one knowing how much capacity their network actually has.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that takes us to our next point around blind spots and risks. We spend a lot of time discussing analytics, efficiency, and dashboards. But if the network itself is fragile, what's the impact? What do owners and operators miss?
So obviously, there's just random downtime on some of these systems, and that's pretty easy to communicate that problem to folks. But I think the biggest win for most organizations in achieving what, I think I'm going to maybe introduce this term here, observability to your OT networks. The biggest win is really around de-risking projects.
Right.
So often we see, we're an IDL provider, so we're going in helping people, get data out of these systems for those dashboards, those analytics, all those sort of higher value executive goals. And what we see is people have poor performing networks that are at the very threshold of what they can do. And then they want to deliver some higher value. They want that dashboard that enables them to, manage their service providers better. They want the analytics that ensures that they can get more lifetime out of their equipment. And when they go to deploy, the project that should have been like a 3-month, this is what we're going to do. We're going to deploy the application. We're going to do the integration. ACE is going to come in and do all the data. All of a sudden, we highlight all the problems that were in that network the whole time, but no one was looking at it. And that goes from a 3-month project to a 6-month project, a 9-month project, because you've got to adjust your network architecture. You've got to make changes to some of the equipment. You've got to replace some legacy devices that were at critical points in the network. So that de-risking is where I see some of the greatest value, because people right now, I talked to a really major analytics provider recently, and definitely not going to name names, but
Okay.
but they were like, our goal is always to get the customer to sign the contract before they figure this out, because we never know how long it's going to take once we get in there and start doing it. And it's almost always at least 3 months extra that we didn't plan on.
Yeah.
So that, if that's like the standard, that tells you what the risk profile is. And so just being able to get a handle and determinism on, okay, this is what we want to do. That's going to be this big project. We're going to be paying a lot of money for software. This year in this budget, we can probably scrape the funds together to figure out the network issues and get them to this point that we know where we're going to be when we go to take on this big project. And it just protects people's careers. I think it's it's de-risking your career. You don't want to be the person who told the executive you're going to deliver all this value by better managing your facility managers, and then a year later they're like, well, where's the value? And you're like, well, we bought the software, but we still don't have data out of 70% of our buildings because the networks couldn't handle it, and the controls vendors don't really have some of the expertise they need, and we're having to bring in specialists. And so I think that's where this really delivers value.
Okay, let's touch on the phrase that you've borrowed, observability and strategy. So this idea of observability from IT, can you unpack what that means in an OT world and why it hasn't really taken hold yet?
So I'll start a little bit earlier than that of what is it in IT, because it's not something that's been around for 30 years. Interestingly, my career has sort of followed observability. This is something that when I was in the industrial space, I was very frustrated with these vertically integrated tools for managing data and long-term time series storage and all that. And so I started turning to the IT field to see what they were doing. And at that time, companies like Netflix and Amazon were releasing these open source softwares that they had built to manage large time series databases in order to evaluate the performance of their systems and improve the reliability and uptime. And they were making that stuff available, so I was using it in the industrial side. And so I started going to these conferences, and from that sort of kernel of hey, we want to track what our systems are doing, and then be able to analyze it over extended periods of time and see exactly how we can improve, where our problems are coming from, which parts of the system are failing most frequently. that really became the science of observability. And so
Right.
that has come, in the IT world, they talk about three things. So they talk about logs, which I think we all understand, like an application log. We can go dig through the logs and kind of work out what happened. And those are kind of unstructured. You just get a bunch of data, and it's kind of a pain to interpret. Metrics, which is numerical performance KPIs of your system. So,
Right.
how much of my processor is being used in this server, how much memory is being used, those sorts of things, really easy to think about in the IT space. And then events and traces, which is basically a log will tell you about a particular application and what it was doing at a particular period of time, and a trace tracks how a service request, for lack of a better term, moves through the system. So, when you go to a website, it's hitting the first thing you hit is a load balancer, and then that goes to a front end server, and then that front end server is making database calls, and so a trace tracks that flow all the way through that, so you can see where your users are hitting parts of the system. I haven't worked out traces for OT yet. I definitely am excited about that, but certainly logs and metrics, getting that level of visibility of like, okay, how many packets per second are happening on my BACnet network? Which devices are talking the most, and then at a per device level,
Yeah.
and not doing that in like, okay, here's a packet capture, good luck. That's kind of the log. That's not really a log because you don't have all the application data, but most BMS systems you can extract logs from. It gets a little more complicated when you start talking about all these third-party BACnet devices that we often have on our network. So the VFDs, the specialized, water controllers that aren't, for your cooling tower, like that stuff typically doesn't have a standardized exposition of its internal logs. But we can determine a lot just from the network behavior, and then actively interrogating the system. Are you alive? That's a very common metric in the IT space, that you actually reach out and touch these systems on a repetitive basis, because even when there's no user traffic or nothing's happening externally, you want to know if it's rebooting itself or going through those kind of things. So when we talk about observability in OT, we're talking about unpacking a lot of times the space between the individual devices. What's going on the network? How many packets are getting from the BMS server to the BBMD in the subnet, and then getting forwarded on into the subnet correctly at the broadcast level. And that stuff often is not exposed by BMS, or, and this is where we do a lot of work, is in campus environments. You may have 3 or 4 different BMS vendors on the same BACnet network, and each one silos any sort of performance metrics in its own system. So trying to get that in an open environment where you can see the entire network, you can see what your equipment in that network is doing, both OT specific, or like building automation system specific, like controllers, but also your switches, your routers, all of that stuff, and get that up into a view where you can make sense of it and detect failures and measure performance thresholds and predict how much capacity you have. That's what we're talking about when we talk about observability.
Definitely sounds like you've been thinking about this for a while. That was a really
There's a lot.
no, it's a really interesting download. I appreciate that. Would like to jump in now and talk about workforce and expertise gap. If networks need this kind of attention, who do you think should own it? Is it FM, IT, contractors, or do we need a new type of role altogether?
So wow. Yeah. So there's the wave a magic wand, right? So I think if you wave a magic wand, you end up with a model like Dartmouth, and Dartmouth's very active in this smart buildings community. I'm sure you've probably talked to Betsy or Doug at one point or another. Doug is a IT employee embedded in the facilities management department with access to the network administration plane, so he can go look at what's on a switch. He can go look at ports, how they're configured. He can see all that stuff, and he understands the building automation system and the needs of the OT system. So I think if you wave a magic wand, that's what you get. However, my real world take is much less spicy because a lot of organizations don't, they don't have the capacity to do that. And maybe that's a 5-year project of getting someone in that position from, convincing your VP that you need it, and them convincing executive leadership that the other VP needs to assign someone. That's a process. So I think it really depends on each organization. I'll give you the engineer's answer, right? It really depends on who has the capacity in your organization. What's important is telling the value story. So 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I helped design the network for a quasi-governmental entity, large power utility for their building automation system here in the Tennessee Valley. And it was a 1 million square foot campus. And we were putting a whole new BMS in, and they recognized that their BMS contractor was not probably the right entity to help them figure out the network. And I was engaged. And there, again, because of playing with the organizational dynamics, there were 2 things we ended up doing. One, hey, we want IT to manage these switches. We want IT to have the logs and have the traces and all this information. We want them to know when the switch is needing to be rebooted. We want them to manage patching the switches. We want all of that. But we don't want to share those switches with everyone else in the building and not know that we have ports available. So we ended up buying switches with facility budget, giving them to IT to provision and manage. And the most important part of that process was getting director level folks to sit down at a conference table, director of facilities, director of IT, and say, hey, this is important. No, we're not going to pay you your SLA that you would charge a normal business unit if they said we want this, because we're providing the network that makes your data center work.
Yeah.
And no one had ever closed that gap in that organization up until that point. So we got pushback and pushback. No, we're not going to give you your own switches. We're not going to manage this for you. We're not pushback until we got those very senior folks to sit down and say, look, your chillers that are running your data center are on our network and they need to be reliable. Your whole data center can go down if this network goes down. Do you understand that? And once we closed that gap, then we found the path forward. So all that to say, I'm not saying that's the model to follow, but I think that meeting of the minds has to happen in every organization. And every organization, it's going to look a little different, because if your IT organization doesn't do a lot with this stuff or doesn't feel like they have internal capacity, then their answer may be, look, we're going to help you. We're going to go to senior leadership and say, hey, you should give facilities management the budget to hire someone for this or bring in a third party. But if they do, then maybe you've got the best ally you can have that helps you build out a system that's robust, and your problems when you want to go do interesting applications and go through cybersecurity review, you have project managers that are already familiar with your systems instead of having to reintroduce it every time. So I really think it comes down to every organization is set up a little differently. And if you think the path to getting a reliable OT network involves completely changing how IT works in your organization, that's probably a non-starter. So figuring out the system that's going to work in your organization is what's important, and it's important to be able to communicate why it's important to them. And it almost always is. They have server racks that they want to keep, reliably cooled. They have something that is dependent on this, and once you kind of close that gap, things get a lot easier.
I like that take. That lived experience. Once you find that button to switch, it's hard for them to resist. So that's a great share. That takes us to our last question, and you've touched a little bit about the idea of healthier models. What would a healthier model for building networks look like? Is it better tools, more standards, managed services, or, like you've maybe touched on, all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what I just described, that scenario is great. That was a really large organization, right? That's like a 10,000 employee organization with a 1 million square foot campus. A lot of entities don't have that kind of capacity, organizational capacity. It's just they may not even have their own internal IT resources. So we do need more managed services in this industry for this use case, especially in medium or single building portfolios, medium buildings, single building portfolios, those kinds of environments where the facilities management team is not very large. It's going to be hard, like, to justify bringing in a whole new person with the kind of experience you need to do this well is not going to really fly, because that's 50% of your budget or something.
Yeah.
So I think in that case, you need folks, and we're trying to figure out what that looks like for ACE, how we offer that service. We think there are other folks who can do that. We think some of the existing IT MSPs are starting to offer some of those services. But it's important that those folks understand these applications. It's not the same thing as come set up a small business network that I'm going to have a few printers and a Wi-Fi AP and 6 laptops on. It's not that. And it does get back to the standards. Like, I think we have plenty of standards on the, how to get logs out of systems, how to measure network traffic, network statistics, all that. We have all that from the IT. We don't need to invent anything new there. There's a little layer of a gap where exposing this stuff to the facilities department in the BMS, so getting that data back into the BMS where they're or whatever application they live in every day, so that they are looking at it the same way they're looking at dirty dirty filter DPs. Like, that's the level the network needs to be raised to, as like a normal maintenance. Hey, the network's not performing well, I need to bring somebody in to help me with this. I need to do filter changes. Like, it's the same. That should be the same thing. These systems are so dependent on the networks. So I think that's really where we're focused. The tools we built are sort of bridging that gap. And then the other gap is like on the IT, again, because of this sort of muddy world of network, physical layer, and the application layer in BACnet. It doesn't fit a lot of the traditional IT tools super well. So some of the stuff we built is specific tools that help you understand what's going on the BACnet application and lower network traffic level, to bring all that into one view, because the IT tools don't quite hit that. So that's where we think some of the gaps are. It's what we're working on. I think it's getting better. And certainly just like bringing visibility to some of that stuff is helping a lot on the projects we're involved in.
Right. Wowzers, that was a great download. Thank you ever so much, Andrew. I always feel like I learn a lot whenever I spend some time with you. So I appreciate your insights. I appreciate the time that you spent. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. I always enjoy these conversations. I'm surprised you're not sick of hearing from me yet, but it's definitely fun, and I think this is an important topic. I think this is something that will shift the industry as we start to get this deployed and learn it and get it internalized to our organizations.
Thanks for joining again. Thank you. That was Andrew Rodgers, co-founder of ACE IoT Solutions. His insights point to one hard truth: without resilient networks, smart building strategies fail before they even start. Here are 3 takeaways to leave you with. 1, audit your OT networks before layering on analytics or dashboards. Fragile OT networks are the reason projects stretch from 3 months to 9. Fixing issues early de-risks big ticket software and analytics rollouts. 2, bring observability to OT. Logs, metrics, and active monitoring aren't just IT practices. They're how you uncover blind spots, detect failures, and improve performance in building networks. And finally, 3, treat networks as infrastructure, not afterthoughts. Managed services, cross-team ownership, and budgeted maintenance need to become standards, just like filter changes or chiller checks. Thanks for watching Quick Cuts. Short episodes, sharp insights, no filler. Catch you next time. You've been listening to the Climate Gap Quick Cuts. If you're building in climate tech, subscribe to hear more from the people making it happen.